Alright, welcome to the Port Huron Statement. The past few episodes, we've been deep in the woods of North Fox Island. We've traced Francis Shelden's flight, his money laundering with Adam Starchild, a fellow trusted boy lover, a pedophile with established trust within Shelden's network. That was their phrasing, trusted boy lover. And we've covered at least vaguely, the staggering witness and victim testimony, circumstantial and physical evidence of their child sex trafficking ring that shockingly is still somewhat publicly accessible today. And definitely you can see scars of it today. There are a lot more victims in Port Huron than you would even... But after the police raided Shelden's Island and the initial articles were printed, most people assumed the story was over. The ringleader had fled. A low-level player, Gerald Richards, was arrested. After years of hunting Shelden, he was pronounced dead in the Netherlands. The public was told the case was closed, and, most critically, the network was kaput. However, that, my friends, was a lie, and remains a lie. The story didn't end in 1977 with Richard's arrest, nor did it end in 1996 with Francis Shelden's pronounced death in the Netherlands. Further, it should be noted that the sole document submitted to U.S. authorities to establish Francis Shelden's death was based on testimony given by none other than Dyer Grossman under the alias of Hackham Bay, which was a pen name and an alias he had established to evade justice. The network didn't die, it traveled, it spread, and it mutated. Because the true purpose of that operation was never just about one man's depravity. It was a proof of concept for a wider system of control, a system we are still living under today. You see, the net Shelden and his associates built was not just an island. It was a franchise protected by a series of fake religious and educational charities, of complicit individuals and partnered individuals in positions of authority in the courts and in law enforcement. Probably the most important of these was the Church of the New Revelation of those charities and religious vehicles. To the IRS, it was a tax-exempt religious organization. In reality, the Church of the New Revelation was a front for multi-state child pornography, a money laundering vehicle, and a direct intellectual predecessor to the religious framework we see deployed today in movements like the New Apostolic Reformation. Let me be clear, these were not isolated perversions. They were the practical application of a cynical strategy. Use the shield of religious freedom to gain access to children, to hide profits, and to ensure network loyalty through an unholy mixture of blackmail and shared secrecy. This brings us to Father Bud's Boys Farm in Tennessee. Claudius Vermilier, known as Father Bud, was an ordained Episcopal minister. Using the same blueprint as Shelden, he turned his home into a farm for boys, which was in reality a house of boy prostitution. He didn't have an airstrip. He was even smarter. He got the state of Tennessee to send him the children and pay him for taking care of them. Father Bud was paid by the county and the state as a foster parent to care for troubled boys. Investigators later described it as an underage rape farm. At one point, the name Francis Shelden himself was found on the farm's visitor list. This was not a coincidence. This was the single network operating across state lines. The Church of the New Revelation wasn't just a name. It was a business model, a concept of control capable of concealing profound depravity. And it wasn't just in Michigan. The same umbrella organization was used to set up nodes across the country, each one a hunting ground disguised as a charity, a camp, or a religious retreat. And one of the most notorious is Father Bud's. This wasn't just a local operation, it was a natural network, one that used fake charities, coded language, and institutional capture to traffic children, launder money, and silence victims. And the worst part is that it's still operating today, just under different names. On paper, the Church of the New Revelation seems like a legitimate religious organization at first glance. One of those tax-exempt charities that sounded wholesome, trustworthy, and above reproach, similar to other charity vehicles that were utilized in a similar manner. The YMCA and Big Brothers Big Sisters, Brother Paul's Christian Mission, But in reality, just like with Brother Paul's, it was a shell, a front for Shelden's network to hide the crimes behind a veneer of piety. The Church of the New Revelation was incorporated in 1971 by Shelden and associates Dyer Grossman and Gerald Richards, and its purpose was explicitly intended from the beginning to launder money, recruit victims, and give the operation a sheen of legitimacy. Because who would suspect a church of running a child trafficking ring? Part of the goal of this process of generating different organizations is to dilute the volume of allegations, to shift the trail of word-of-mouth leakage by diluting the number of potential rumors associated with an individual organization that reach the broader population and especially the police or press. The use of complicit members of a congregation, courts, and law enforcement working to protect and conceal the operation. They utilize further the dilution as a solution model by creating multiple different charities and religious organizations and associating them with different ones at different locations and different times, means that it's less likely that a volume of victims would be, like a critical mass would be sort of reached in order to compel a serious investigation, especially against the inertia that's created by complicity within the legal system and criminal justice system that was assisting and protecting Shelden's network. By using this multitude of different names, the full gravity of allegations against any one of them is reduced. And here's the thing, the Church of the New Revelations, as well as all of this, was a template, one that fit into a mold being promoted United States government and specifically the CIA to fight the communism of liberation theology, the interpretation of the Bible that was motivating civil and human rights and democratic movements across the Americas. The federal government, military, and intelligence community, and even the Vatican became integrated into the missionary work of countless different religiously backed efforts to suppress this liberation theology movement. Newly created Christian organizations associated with the CIA were designed to reinterpret the Bible to prevent cooperation between communities in pursuit of better conditions, rights, and countering corruption. Shelden and his network were benefiting from the intentional encouragement and financing of Christian ideologies that were considered contrary to this liberation theology and the domestic parallel movements like STS and the Port Huron Statement. Bolstered by operations intended to deploy this new Apostolic Reformation and parallel Protestant and Vatican II and non-denominational momentum, these kinds of operations became easily replicated across the country by Shelden, his associates, and the greater ecosystem of child exploitation, social control, manipulation, and steering through religious capture. So, we're going to go in a little bit more detail into Father Bud's Boys Farm. In 1971, a man named Claudius Bud Vermeil Jr., a man who, like Shelden and his associates, utilized a multitude of different spellings and nicknames across legal documents, in the press and in social circles, a form of simple obfuscation utilized by many in the boy lover movement and subsequently to this day among people in the blackmail economy and the pedophile rings that emerged and directly are descendant from this operation. For example, Shelden utilized these spellings SHELDEN, SHELDON, and SHELTON for Francis and Frank Shelden. Sometimes he'd also use a D, sometimes he wouldn't use a D, and sometimes he'd use Duffield. He also used Frank Douglas Shelden. He also would utilize the last name Torrey, Torrey, and Altman, Altman, among others, though those are the ones that I've noticed most frequently associated with Francis Duffield Shelden. And then Claudius, who went by Bud in most circles, also utilized multiple spellings of his last name, in various documents like Vermeil, Vermeil, Vermelia, Vermilye, and Vermeil, Vermyle. After being defrocked for inappropriate relations with children, he was reinstated by the Episcopal Church and immediately established Father Bud's Boys Farm in Franklin County, Tennessee. The townspeople couldn't understand why it was called a farm. The property was just on 1.5 acres with a 7-room A-frame house. It was considered the nicest and was likely the most expensive residential property in the area, but it wasn't really a farm. It was more of a hunting ground. Vermeil had a long history of accessing vulnerable children. In the 1960s, he had convinced his congregation to fund a boys' home through donations. He made a pass at a boy living there and another member of his church. These two complaints resulted in the bishop being informed, but instead of notifying law enforcement, the bishop simply accepted Vermeil's resignation as pastor and helped him find secular employment. That secular employment was chaplain of the State Youth Development Center in Augusta, Georgia, where he had access to hundreds more children. Unbelievably, in the wake of the volume of allegations that continued to mount against Vermeil, the Episcopal Church eventually restored his ordination. Even in the wake of the Boys Center in Augusta, Georgia kicks him out for inappropriate behavior with boys, but he still gets reinstated. A bishop issues him a courtesy license enabling him to hold Episcopal services in Tennessee. And so this creates a veneer of legitimacy. And that's when he opened the Father Bud's Boys Farm. Vermeil's farm operated exactly like North Fox Island. In fact, there's a ton of evidence that it was fully financed by Francis Duffield Shelden, almost certainly. But anyway, he placed coded advertisements in magazines soliciting sponsors. A man could donate $25 to sponsor a troubled boy in the boys' farm. In return, he would receive a roll of 35mm film depicting the boy that he had sponsored posing nude. If the sponsor wanted more graphic content, he paid extremely high prices, but was offered, as he became trusted, opportunities to curate the material. If he didn't respond with interest in more material, they played it off like it was a mistake. Oh, we didn't mean to send you that pnog of young boy. And it worked. There were actually multiple people that get interviewed in the wake of these. They're like, yeah, I got that pnog of boys. Yeah, I just kept giving him $25. I just thought it was a mistake. He told me it was a mistake. Think about that mistake. Anyway. It's hard to believe that there's good faith behind the statement that, oh, I thought it was a mistake. He told me it was a mistake. How does that mistake work? Anyway, Vermeil was careful never to allow any pictures of himself to be taken. He explained his reasoning to a sponsor who would later testify in court. He said, quote, such pictures would be hard to explain to the bishop, and the vetting process for potential sponsors was extensive. Far more thorough than any government background check. Network members would visit the pedophile's place of employment, inspect his home, review his criminal records, and they expected to see taxes. They expected to see, birth certificates, your driver's license. They expected, they expected a sort of absolute insight into the person's sort of past and their financial situations and everything. It was a means of also guaranteeing that it was unlikely that a police officer would be integrated with the intention of arresting them, because they definitely integrated police officers. Anyway, only those who passed were assigned a number and deemed a trusted boy lover and were given the BL hash number that they would use in this mail ring. Francis Shelden was found featured in pornography filmed at the Boys Farm in Tennessee. Material briefs of Father Bud's Boys Farm was published in Better Life Monthly, the same magazine where Shelden and Richards had placed their own ads and ultimately met. This national network, stretching from Michigan to Tennessee to the halls of power in D.C., And the mechanics were identical to North Fox Island and to Epstein, to the same tactics that we see today. Vermeule's customer list eventually contained 270 names from for almost every state, 40 different states, the U.S., Canada, and Australia. Some of those names came from Michigan, and the same tactics of grooming, gaslighting, financial shell games, friends in courts and police departments and political office were used to silence victims and protect the predators. And the Church of the New Revelation, it wasn't just a front for Vermeule's farm. It was one that Shelden and his network were utilizing for laundering money, recruiting victims, and to hide their own crimes behind the shield of virtue. Now let's fast forward to today, because the Church of the New Revelation didn't disappear. It evolved, and the tactics it used, fake charities, coded language, and financial shell games, are still being used by a cacophony of modern movements, notably the New Apostolic Reformation, the ICC or ICOC, the 2x2s or the Way, and the same specter of normalized child sexual exploitation has permeated countless cultures of clergy, from the LDS to the Southern Baptist Church to the Catholic Church to Scientology. But the NAR isn't just a religious movement. It's a political project, one that seeks to impose a theocracy on America by taking control of what they call the 7 mountains of society: religion, family, education, government, media, arts and entertainment, and business. And just like the Church of the New Revelation, the NAR uses coded language to signal its true goals to its followers while flying under the radar for the majority of the population. When they talk about apostolic realignment, they're not talking about unity in the church. They're talking about submission to their modern day apostles, self-appointed leaders who claim to have direct authority from God. When they talk about spiritual warfare, they're not talking about prayer. They're talking about a political and cultural battle against anyone who resists their vision of a Christian theocracy. And when they talk about advancing the kingdom, they're not talking about evangelism. They're talking about taking dominion or domination over society. When they talk about advancing the kingdom, it's not evangelical, it's not evangelism. They're talking about domination of society, of press, of media, of business, of government, of family, of religion, of education. And that brings us to Port Huron, because the same network that ran North Fox Island and Father Bud's Boys Farm just changed its name and some of its henchmen. Today it's operating under the guise of several local church and charity entities, such as notable examples like Colonial Woods and Christians for a New Tomorrow, and the same tactics utilized of hiding money through charities is being exploited by some notable local charities like the Sheriff's Dive Team Auxiliary. These are actually part of one cohesive network. Let's start with Colonial Woods. This isn't just a church, it's a hub for the NAR and the Masonic network. You see, a lot of these Masons end up operating within these church organizations and orchestrating the laundering and embezzlement through them. This church, Colonial Woods, which we'll cover in detail in a future episode, was central to the Jackie Woodburn situation, which was a far-reaching child exploitation case from just a few years ago right here in Port Huron. In fact, it involved dozens of underage victims. These were exclusively young girls. The same bloodlines that were established in the 70s by Shelden and the infrastructure of North Fox Island are alive today and well in another major case of child exploitation from just a couple years ago in the River and Stephen Wall. There are actually a lot of these cases. Cornerstone, and then we'll talk about at some point probably Lakeshore Graphics. That there's this is. And then when you talk about the laundering and embezzling tactics, we can talk about the Huron House. This is about a 30 episode series to completely establish the history and then tie this money in a cascade together, not only thematically, but also directly, Anyway, in both the Jackie Woodburn situation and the Wall situation of the river, professionals determined both churches were host to a persistent culture of misogyny, secrecy, and child sexualization far beyond the activities of a single actor. So, Stephen Wall Jr. Is essentially the fall guy in the river, and Jackie Woodburn in the case of Colonial Woods and the Colonial Woods Christian Counseling, because he was also the head psychologist. And all of this is financially, personally, and thematically deeply connected to Christians for a New Tomorrow, a charity that's blatantly laundering money, exploiting children, and protecting predators, which we'll go into in detail in a subsequent episode. This charity is deeply associated with individuals embroiled in accusations of child sexual exploitation, and it's also pretty clearly engaged in money laundering and embezzlement. Again, in a subsequent episode, we'll go through their financials. The truth is, these organizations are closely related to a greater scheme of control. They're tied to individuals like Billy Graham, who himself is tied to the CIA and DARPA's behavior modification experiments. This is a charity that's using the same grooming tactics as Shelden and Vermeil, as the finders and the keepers, targeting vulnerable children using fake scholarships, fake opportunities, fake religions, fake churches to lure them in. So how does it all connect? Let's follow the money, the power, and the lies. From Shelden's Church of the New Revelation to Vermeil's Boys Farm to the modern NAR apparatus. The Church of the New Revelation was a prototype, a testing ground for the NAR's psychological warfare and exploitation machine. The CIA provided the intelligence and the money, and the Mafia provided the social and financial infrastructure in addition to CIA backing. The NAR provided the ideological framework, and the result, a system of control that's still operating today, one that uses child exploitation, blackmail, and behavior modification to maintain power. And one of the key targets that they were trying to suppress, the Port Huron Statement. This is a major and explicitly stated threat to this system. It was a blueprint for liberation that had to be destroyed. And this is according to a surprising amount of internal documents at the CIA and the FBI. Nixon was talking about it constantly. And they're literally telling these people in theological roles to demonize movements that are promoting democracy. It's so crazy. Or like promoting just basic civil and human rights are being actively targeted for demonization because Nixon's insisting on it, because democracy is contrary to the singular hierarchy that they're trying to build, utilizing God as the, stand-in to justify their power, and because a singular God can't really be argued with. So the idea is, you become a messenger of God and then you cannot be sort of defied. It creates a singular hierarchy. The God, they don't really believe in this God per se either. And then this goes into the ideology of the people that control the churches and the congregations, and this greater mechanism versus the people that are subjected to that control. Because the people that control it, they believe in the Bible in the sort of Kabbalist way. It's really common in NAR. So, anyway, no small portion of the inspiration for targeting the region, St. Clair County, for exploitation, and there has been large amounts of money moved to this area in order to prevent it from being a liberal bastion, as it was referenced by Henry IV II, I think. He didn't want it to become a liberal bastion in Automation Alley. Pretty sure it might be someone else, but that was the inspiration for targeting the reason was the Port Huron Statement and the formation of Students for a Democratic Society. There's no other means to stop the generational trauma than to stop this network and to drain their power by ceasing to believe their lies or to submit to their intimidation. We overcome this oppression through the truth-tellers, the whistleblowers, and the dissidents, through becoming a people who refuse to accept their simulacrum. Pay attention, look at the logos of local businesses, look at the names, look at local churches and charities. Pay attention to names, advertisements, tattoos, language, and behavior. There are a lot of echoes and dog whistles and coded language being utilized currently by the contemporary versions of these same exploitation networks. They like to mark their obedience. They like to create cues for subsequent exploitive individuals to know what buttons to push. This is actually related to a CIA tactic. Handlers like to keep the people that they're managing in a sort of set of personas that have easy and predictable trigger points, and then creating visible cues to communicate to other handlers or operatives in that network how to manipulate those people, like convincing them to more or less tattoo themselves with the secret coded language of how to exploit them. But anyway, yeah. So there are a lot of dog whistles that are out in the wild, as they say. Listen to the language when you hear the terms like apostolic alignment, spiritual warfare, or advancing the kingdom. Ask yourself, who is in control? Because the NAR isn't just a religious movement, it's a high-control political paradigm, and it's one that's been decades in the making. This isn't a few bad actors, this is a strategy. While this was happening in the church, the CIA was running parallel projects exploiting children and looking into the potential value such practices would pose. Projects like MKUltra, Project Monarch, among others. Further, later projects like the Finders and the Keepers explicitly sought to exploit children using a religious paradigm to excuse and enable the abuse. This became the standard operating procedure by the 1980s. In these illegal secret programs, the agency or the company, for those in the know, conducted horrifying experiments on unwitting citizens, usually recruited through farms like Port Huron. I mean, this is where they recruited people to experiment on child psychology, experiments that people wouldn't have signed their children up for, you know. They justified it as necessary to win the Cold War. They had to torture these kids to find out if the Soviets were torturing these kids to create, you know, these mind-controlled assassins. Was kind of like the gold standard, and that gets into learned helplessness and an established and documented series of programs designed to break children's identity and use that as a means to mold them into a tool or an action figure to make them posable. There's a bunch of terms like this. It's all effed up. I'm going to try and include some of the stuff that's declassified up here. I have some access to... I've been reading through the legislation, and I need to be careful not to put anything that's still classed, because it's weird. You can end up stumbling into classed material in the public space. It is possible. Not say that swearing, but yeah, a lot of this is declassified. We'll just say that. These techniques of psychological conditioning were designed to break a person's will, to create amnesiatic barriers, so memory holing is one of the terms that they actually use, and to program individuals for specific tasks, to turn them into what the program would term then as willing slaves. The CIA also had a direct hand in the systemic infiltration of pedophiles and cover-ups within the Catholic Church itself. Part of this was to create an exodus away from established church hierarchies and into hierarchies that they had established themselves. This infiltration of the Catholic Church by the CIA actually has a documented history. In the 1970s, a cardinal in the Catholic Church was accused of running an intelligence network that bugged people, audiences, and passed information to the CIA. The volume of information confirming that this and other parallel operations, usually with lower-level members of the Catholic Church clergy, were in fact going on. And in recent years, declassified reports have revealed that the CIA had credible evidence that at least 10 of its own employees were involved in child sex crimes over a relatively short 14-year period. So it had uncovered that a striking number of CIA employees were committing child sexually abusive crimes outside of the purview of any legitimate national security intelligence operation. They were using their national security credentials to enable assorted crimes like money laundering and child sex trafficking. The CIA also had a direct hand. The CIA also had a direct hand in covering up these crimes. The agency did not prosecute them or assist in their prosecution, and instead it hushed it up, handling the cases internally to protect its own. The CIA seized on the opportunity and the information rather than deciding to do its job and try and protect the American people. It's not an agency, an entity that's actually operating for your best interest. It's operating for the best interest of entrenched special interest groups. They were doing more than protecting their own when they hushed this internal investigation. And again, every time something like this is actually done, where they do look internally, it reveals a lot of internal criminality, so they just don't do it anymore. They were protecting the same tools of coercion that were being perfected right under our noses for decades. So why does this matter today? Because this isn't ancient history. The system these people built, these networks, did far more than just destroy children. It gave them the compromising material they needed to control the entire and political opposition. It's the same playbook they used to crush the Port Huron Statement and the Students for Democratic Society in the 1960s. It's the playbook the Nazis used to propel an unpopular movement to total dominance. The SDS, founded in Port Huron, Michigan, called for total disarmament, an end to racism, and a new vision for a society based on participatory democracy. As a direct result of calling for a more true democracy, the FBI branded them a revolutionary Marxist-Leninist movement, for calling for disarmament, an end to racism, and participatory democracy. The FBI branded SDS as a revolutionary Marxist-Leninist movement, and their classified domestic political paramilitary operation COINTELPRO worked tirelessly to infiltrate, discredit, and destroy this movement and everything that it touched. Honeypotting and sexual blackmail attempts were commonplace, but was most effective, however, was the drugs and invented and injected division, the placed poisonous people, and the baited altercations they inspired. All of this while the NAR and the RNC-aligned Christian organizations were literally demonizing the individuals and the efforts of the SDS and parallel groups to realize a better future. They were considering this effort to improve the lives of everyday Americans to be explicitly demonic. Obviously, they're not accurately portraying the reality of SDS to the congregation, but all that the congregation is really getting is that SDS is demonic. It's the same playbook they used to fight liberation theology in Latin America, the movement that dared to say the church should fight for the poor. The CIA didn't just use guns, they used ideology. They funded, promoted, and weaponized Pentecostalism and the new Apostolic Reformation in their missions across the Americas, partnering with their missionaries and placing their personnel undercover with them. They designed and selected the specific ideologies they were assisting and promoting in the Americas to create a theology of personal salvation and political obedience among the populations that would keep them docile, to make their sacrifice virtuous, to make their suffering expected in service of clergy, authority, and power. Their profit, our sacrifice. This is the world we've inherited, a world where religious institutions have been systematically infiltrated to serve as laundering machines and abuse franchises, not as sanctuaries. A world where the intelligence community, tasked with protecting us, created the modern playbook for mind control and systematically shielding pedophiles within its own ranks to further their power. We see it today in the Bill Gothard cult and the Institute in Basic Life Principles, IBLP. Gothard crafted a theology of absolute male patriarchy and umbrella authority. Under this umbrella, accusations of child abuse are met with dismissal, and victims are taught that their suffering was a spiritual test of their obedience. This is the same pattern we saw from the Church of the New Revelation. This is the same pattern as all of the virtue shields that were utilized by North Fox Island, Shelden, and his acolytes, using theology to protect abusers and cultivate learned helplessness in the victims. So when we looked at the new Apostolic Reformation churches popping up across Port Huron and across the country, when we hear about the scandals at Colonial Woods or the charade at the Milk House Cafe, don't think of them as separate random events. They're part of a single coherent and historical system of control, one that connects to Jeffrey Epstein. The mafia fronts, the intelligence ops, the welfare and medical charities, the fake churches, they all form an interconnected machine designed for one purpose: to extract value, to generate leverage, and to control populations by preying on their most vulnerable. The question now is not whether this network exists. We will continue to prove that it does. The question is what we can do about it. The system relies on secrecy, but secrecy is hard to maintain when the truth starts leaking out. When people start connecting the dots, when they realize that the same names, the same tactics, the same modus operandi keep showing up, from North Fox Island to the new Apostolic Reformation, from the 1970s to today. In the next episode, we'll dive deeper into Shelden's flee from justice, and we'll showcase all of the different locations that he went to after leaving Michigan, and how the FBI tailed him at a distance, and the depositions people gave, and how Shelden's flight from justice reveals the true scale of this network. And this is the Port Huron Statement. Roger Shelden, thank you.